I had forgotten about Fort Worth. There's so many remembrances, and since you mentioned that. Brother Joe Gilmore and I were to do some TV shows for, I don't know which congregation now, it might have been Brown Trail. Go and record 30-minute television program. It was all preaching. And while we're sitting, I asked Brother Gilmore if he would give his Indian whoop, and he did. And the studio was above us, and the person running the studio ran down the stairs, wanted to know what happened. And Brother Gilmore said he caused it. But that was a long, long time ago. A great pleasure to be with you and enjoyed so much all of the speeches. Paul called one, it was called that, Luke wrote that, of Paul, continued speech till midnight. And the late Brother Guyan Woods, occasionally, in making a strong point, he would say, if you remember one thing about this speech, you remember this. And he would make that particular point. We enjoyed all of them very, very much and look forward to tonight and Brother Doug and then tomorrow. Been a pleasure to be in your midst and to have Mike Carey with me. I could not help but think about a moment ago, because I guess 20 or more years ago, regarding the plagues, Michael, I preached a sermon, One More Night with the Frogs. When you want these frogs removed? He said, tomorrow. And can you imagine, ladies, you go to turn back the covers and the bed's full of frogs. Let the oven door down and it's full of frogs. Go to the flour bin, the safe, and it's full of frogs everywhere. When you want them gone? Tomorrow. One more night with the frogs. The best lesson regarding the wilderness wanderings inspired, and I'm not. If you really want an account of the wilderness wanderings, then I would suggest Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 3. Because here is when the prophet Moses, Deuteronomy 18:15, he said the Lord would raise up a prophet like unto me, speaking of him. And him shall you hear in all things. He was speaking of Christ. A prophet is one who foretold. We somewhere along the line had the idea that one had told the future. Well, they did, but it was foretelling. Moses lived hundreds of years, and this point has been made, hundreds of years after the events that he recorded, and yet he was foretelling by inspiration, writing down these events in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and then in Numbers. Leviticus is a book that covered 1 month. Though it may be longer for us to read, it still covered 1 month. And a challenge to the Levitical side of these. My lesson will pick up actually in Numbers chapter 9, and you have what's in the book. I think it started with chapter 11. And I'm going to try to go as far as I can through about chapter 26, if I can, and hit some of the high points of the wanderings of the children of Israel. I'd like to start in Exodus 12, though I said I'll start in Numbers 9. But I want to start with the Passover and them getting out of the land, and the blood on the doorpost and the lintels, and what the Passover suggested and what it implies. It's a type of deliverance. I said last evening that the Bible is a book about sin and redemption. This is one of the pictures of redemption of the children of Israel coming out of Egyptian bondage. I'd also like to say this evening that the Bible is a book about people and places. The Bible is not a book for God. The Bible is a book that shows us and tells us how God dealt with those things in those days. And people now are not a lot different from those times. And we will take this Bible and apply it, old and new, to our lives, then we will know how to handle better the problems of today. Our problem is we do not know much about the Bible overall. We have a lot of ignorance in our society today. And our job to spread the word to all the world and to make them knowledgeable of the love of God and how to handle the problems of life that we face. That's what the Bible did. It helped those people in those places overcome the problems that they have. And it'll do the same today if we will make the application. The Passover was a passing over of the doom that was really deserved. In 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, Paul wrote that Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. We deserve to die for our own sins. But Christ died as the Passover lamb to satisfy the wrath of God when we deserve to die for our own sins. The Passover was unique in that. There was the sprinkling of the blood. That is an open confession of our wrongs. To openly admit I have sinned. And it's not easy to say I'm wrong. It takes much courage to say I've wronged. Sometimes pent-up emotions, sometimes pride keeps us from saying, I have sinned. I'm wrong. Please forgive me. The sprinkling of the blood and the applying of the blood was that. The Passover meal, to be eaten quickly and to be eaten before the Sabbath. The idea of eating it, no good unless it was eaten. And then the bitter herbs, indicating also repentance on their part. And the background, of course, is the humble and contrite repentance that we need to have. Crossing the Red Sea, they are no more than a few days, maybe a dozen, 15 days from the land of Canaan, floating milk and honey, taking their time. It was by God's desire that they go by Sinai. And that period takes up a period of about 2 years, according to the dates that we have in the Scriptures. About 2 years. However, that is still in the wilderness. But the real wilderness wanderings that we're talking about began after Sinai. And the problems that they faced and the things that they did and the things that they did not do in order to be pleasing in the sight of God. And mentioning chapter 9 and verse number 1, the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness Sinai in the first month, second year, they were come out of the land of Egypt. And they had to keep the Passover that had already been instituted. Now, brethren, I'd like to suggest something here. Trace this Passover, and you'll see that it begins to not be used as far as the divine record is concerned. Passover was important. It was so important that in Exodus 12, it was the beginning of months. It started a new year. The Passover was that important. Everything quit and it started a new year, and the 14th day of the month. And they were to keep that from then on. But outside the book of Numbers on further, you only find it mentioned 4 or 5 times. You see how weak people are getting? When they have their own way, do their own thing, let it all hang out, as some have suggested in past time. The Passover, along with other things, of the problem in that. In the 9th chapter, the tabernacle is reared up. We're at a period of time, I'd like to go back and look at the tabernacle. Because God had promised where I put my name, there I'll be in the midst of you. And there's that cloud and a pillar of fire at night. And when the cloud rested, they were supposed to stop and be in their tents. And he was in the tabernacle in that pillar of cloud. And if we can get to it, we will see him standing at the door of the tabernacle. It was his presence. That's where they would meet him. And they forgot. They forgot. In this same chapter, verse number 18, please notice of 9 of Numbers, at the commandment of the Lord, the children of Israel journeyed. At the commandment of the Lord, they pitched. As long as the cloud abode upon the tabernacle, they rested in their tents. I'm reading this to underscore one thing. Verse 20. And so it was when the cloud was a few days upon the tabernacle, according to the commandment of the Lord, they abode in their tents, according to the commandment of the Lord, they journeyed. And so it was when the cloud abode, even unto the morning, and that cloud was taken up in the morning, that they journeyed, whether it was by day or by night, that the cloud was taken up, they journeyed. Do you notice a word here in these verses? I believe it's 4 times that the word commandment. Every what the Lord commanded, that's precisely what they did. They did not want to go beyond His commandment at this point. They did not want to come short of His commandment. That would have been a transgression of God's law. It's going beyond God's law. Coming short of God's law is a transgression and unrighteousness. And so here's a picture. In the early part of their beginnings, where they wish to do the commandment and keep the commandments of the Lord. And verses 18 through 23, I didn't get to 23. At the command of the Lord, they rested in their tents. When the cloud is here, you rest. You stay in the tents. If it's a long time, sometimes a year, then they could come out of their tents. But they were commanded to be in those tents, and they wanted to simply keep the commandments of the Lord. Chapter 10 is a record of the trumpets. Moses told them to make 2 trumpets. They were to be identical trumpets as far as we can tell. And these trumpets were for various things. One was a sign of danger. There was that particular sound of that trumpet. To keep the sound of that trumpet and to know what the sounds of the trumpets were. A call to move, not to move, but a call to assemble or whatever that was. And we do not know the sound that it gave. We do know in their orders of arrangement, 3 tribes on this side of the tabernacle, 3 here, 3 there, and 3 there, making up the 12 tribes. But there was an assembly of the trumpet. I remember well in taped conversations that was with Brother Guy in Woods, that he mentioned as a boy in Holiday, Tennessee, where they lived, that they lived beside the church building. And it was his responsibility on Sunday mornings at precisely 9:30 to go out and ring the bell for a little while. I believe he mentioned how many times it clanged, but to read a little while. He said, Harold, many of them did not have timepieces in those days. And there was a call to assemble. Back home at Locust Grove, my home congregation outside of Bradford, Tennessee, country congregation. There's a bell tower in the parking lot, set up on big poles up high. We may be in the field plowing or whatever, and we hear the bell, tolling of the bell. And during the day, not the Lord's Day, but during the day, we knew that someone had passed. It's time for us to assemble at the cemetery where we will be buried. At the cemetery to dig graves for every who it was that died in the community. A calling together of the people. On a lighter note, there was a man that was raising hogs. And every day at a certain time of the day, he'd go out and he'd call the hogs and throw out corn and feed and whatever for them. And finally, the gentleman lost his voice. What am I going to do? Guy passing by said, well, if you'll go out the same time of the day and just peck on the fence post, they'll learn to come to it. Sure enough, it worked. Same gentleman was passing by months, maybe a year or so later. He saw the hogs on the hillside running wild. And he stopped and he asked the man, he could hear. He said, what has happened? The man took the writing pad and he said, I've been invaded by a bunch of woodpeckers. Now, brethren, they had to know the sound of the bells or the trumpets. We need to know the sounds. Uncertain sound. Paul tells Timothy and Titus about sound doctrine, sound in speech, and sound lives as far as we're concerned, to be sound. There's a certain ring to the truth, and there certainly is a violent ring to error. And it starts by creeping along, and we see that in the wanderings of the children of Israel. It starts creeping in, like I suggested. Look at the Passover. Look at the tabernacle. and see what happens to it. For instance, in 2 Kings chapter 23, about verses 21 through 23, the writer records that all the days of the judges and all the days of the king, they did not keep the Passover. What? Were they to keep it on the first month, 14th day of the month? Yes. All the time of the judges. What did they do? Well, the writer of the book of Judges said every man did that was right in his own eyes. They set themselves up as judgment. We don't need that old stuff anymore. So they did not do it. The kings? No. That's 2 Samuel chapter 23. They did not keep the Passover until the 18th year of Josiah, and he commanded that Passover to be kept. There's a problem. They did not keep the commandment of the Lord that they vowed and started early to keep. But the people that came along would not do it. Chapter 11, there's complaining, verse 1. Complaining against everything that Moses and Aaron was doing. And this complaining so displeased the Lord that he sent fire and it burned round about them. And here's their leader. I appreciate what Michael said earlier about Moses giving excuses. Moses was not a perfect man. He was not a strong man in many respects. But God does not have to have the strongest people to do what he needs to be done. Some of us who are extremely weak can sometimes hit a home run. And other times it's difficult for us to make the grade. But Moses went to bat for the people every time. Every time. And the ones that the people wanted to crucify, the ones that went to bat for them, God wanted to destroy them. No, not that. Who's causing the problem? In Exodus 12, there's a mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. And this mixed multitude, I believe that they're hangers-on. I believe that's the best description of them. They were the hangers-on. No idea about what all they believed or what they didn't believe. They were just hanging on. But they were among the people, and they influenced the people, and the people started complaining because of the hangers-on. And that is dealt with throughout this chapter. And what are they thinking about? They begin to think about the fish, verse 5. And here it is, brethren. They thought about the cucumbers. Who said something about a cucumber sandwich lately? They thought about the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Brethren, what had they forgot? They forgot the bricks. They forgot the bricks over yonder in Egypt. Oh, we're thinking about the fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the onions, the garlic. That'd give them strong breath anyway. But anyway, they forgot the bricks. The manna was a coriander seed, color thereof as the... And God for 40 years supplied miraculously manna. Never been duplicated and never will be. And when they would go finally in the land of Canaan, you need all the book of Deuteronomy and first of Joshua. When they would go in the land of Canaan, there was no more, after they're there, there's no more manna. Because you'll have houses you didn't build, furniture you didn't make, crops planted that you didn't plant, vineyards that you didn't set out. You won't need the manna anymore. Does God provide? Absolutely. Everything that they needed, provided. Not one of them starved to death that used the manna properly. But that wasn't enough for them. Caused Israel to stumble. Also in this chapter, there's no meat. And they're wanting some meat to eat. And God said, all right, I'll give you meat. And Moses questioned God. He said, you mean, how am I going to supply this for all this host of people? And we know how many there were. Males 20 years old and upward, able to do battle, not infirm, able to go to battle with 603,550 men. 20 years old and upward. Moses said, how am I going to feed these people? You bring me out here to do all this big job, feeding these people, how am I going to do that? And God tells him what to do. He says, you will not for a day, you'll not for 10 days or 20 days, but for a whole month you're going to eat meat. And while that meat was between their teeth, people started perishing. But I love the expressions that we have here in the Scriptures. Brought quails from the sea. That's not the normal place for them to come from, is it? I've been quail hunting a few times in my life. Had a fair old bird dog a while. I never did find a bird out in the sea. I found them in fence rows and hedges in the middle of wheat fields and stuff like that. But they came from the sea. Let them fall by the camp, as it was a day's journey on this side. A day's journey is how far? Well, I know, I'm just going to say 4 or 5 miles, and it's more than that, but 4 or 5 miles. Can you imagine north, south, east, and west? Let's just say 3 miles, just for sake of saying something and illustrating. 3 miles on either side of the camp. 4 sides. 3 miles. A day's journey. 2 cubits deep. If a cubit is 18 inches, the measure from the elbow to the finger, tip of the finger, that's 3 feet, right? Now, Moses, what was your complaint? Now, his complaint is not like the people. How am I going to do this, God? Quail come from the sea, 3 miles that way, that way, that way, and so deep. I can't imagine, can't picture it actually. Though I'm trying to give us some look at it, what it could be like. Chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron comes along and complain about Moses. Brother, you have just got too much to do. And she must have been the ringleader in this. You've got too much to do. Let us have some of this responsibility. God told them to meet him at the tabernacle. And he tells them abruptly to do that. The Lord spake suddenly unto Moses and unto Aaron and unto Miriam, come out ye 3 unto the tabernacle of the congregation. They came out, and the Lord come. He came down in a pillar of cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle. I mentioned he stood one time, didn't I? Suddenly. Now, they knew what God's presence was in the cloud. They understood that. They knew that. Because they kept the commandment of the Lord back early, you see. Moses, Miriam, Aaron. When God says, suddenly, meet me, well, they knew he met where he put his name. They go to the tabernacle. He stands, the Bible shows the picture of him standing at the door of the tabernacle and telling Miriam and Aaron what's to happen. And my servant Moses is not like other prophets. I speak to them in visions and so forth, but him I speak mouth to mouth. The anger of the Lord was kindled against them. He departed, the cloud departed. And when the cloud departed, look over at Miriam. And she is as leprous as one could be. That's why, in my judgment, I think she's a ringleader. Aaron was not leprous, but she was. Moses pleaded for his sister. Perhaps there was healing. God said, oh, no, we're not going to do that. She's going to go 7 days and do what was prescribed, to the tribe of Levi, the Levitical priesthood, to go the priest then, though that's not mentioned here. That's precisely what had to happen for 7 days, and they would have to look at the sore and see if it was oozing. If it was still oozing, then it was still leprosy. If it was scaled over and dried up, she was pronounced clean and then had to go through the cleansing process. Miriam had to do what any other leper had to do. God said, I'm not making exception for someone that complained against my chosen person. Now, brethren, there's a side point here, and I'm never going to get through where I want to go. But our host is generous with the time. Well, I'll just go on. I had so many things I want to say about that. But the healing process could not be effected. Chapter 13, the sending of the spies out. And Houston, we've got a problem here. This shows God saying, send the spies. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 21 and 22, Moses recalls the situation. God told them to send the spies after Moses has says, go and take the land. That's what God said do. The scriptures must harmonize. And that's the only way that Numbers 13 and Deuteronomy 1 will harmonize. Verses 21 and 22 of Deuteronomy 1, behold, the Lord thy God has set the land before thee. Go up and possess it, as the Lord thy God of the fathers has said of thee. Fear not, neither be discouraged. And he came near unto every one of you, and he said, we will send men before us. God said, go and do it. They said, we're going to send men before us. That was not what God said. But God let that happen. Now, I believe that's a proper rendering between Numbers 13 and Deuteronomy 1. God permitted various things to happen that he never did approve of. He never approved, if I understand Matthew 19, he never approved of multiple marriages, but he permitted it because of the hardness of people's heart. Other things God let go on that he did not validate, he did not put his stamp of approval. He did not vouchsafe it. He said, you go and take the land. Well, their question, can we do it or not? We need to have 12 spies to go and look at that. How long did it take? They took 40 days. Now, what did God say about the 40 days? He said in chapter 14, because you took 40 days, a day for a year, you're going to be in the wilderness for 40 days, and you will not enter the land that flows with milk and honey. Now, this unfaithfulness, this complaining, this murmuring had been building. And just make a note of and put in the thought process 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and the first verses about Miriam and Aaron complaining, murmur ye as some of them did, and so forth. We have an inspired record over here in the New Testament of these things also. 40 years. The angst of God starts building over here. When they start complaining. So he says 40 years. And that's how long. And that's what the 40 years is based upon as far as the divine record is concerned. The 40 days, 40 years, and this generation of doubters will not enter into the land of Canaan. And God said, Joshua and Caleb, the two spies that brought back a positive report, why discourage ye the children of Israel? They said. The other said, we are as grasshoppers in our sight. That's what they thought about themselves. Look at Moses' record in Deuteronomy. He said, they're walled cities. That's what the spies said. They're walled cities there. We can't do it. Well, Moses learned about the quail. He knew God could do it. Moses keeps interceding for the people, but he can't intercede and keep these people out of, keep them and let them go in the land of Canaan. And I'm sure that none of our brethren this day and time would be as it was in me growing up. How many of you have heard, just a rhetorical question, don't raise your hand or anything. Well, you can if you want to, but how many of you heard that only Joshua and Caleb in the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb. The Levites were not numbered. Levites were not numbered. And they produce very well, and I'll show maybe in the last words, show how they produced over this 40-year period. How can they do that with Joshua and Caleb? But see, that's what I heard as a boy, and a teenage boy, leading singing gospel meetings for various gospel preachers, whom I'm so thankful to be able to do. You see, it had to do with their tribes. Those of those 20 years old and upward did not perish. The 10 tribes perished 20 years old and upward. So when the Bible says Joshua and Caleb, let us explain what this is about, not just make a statement. Only Joshua and Caleb entered the land of Canaan. They did, tribe-wise, keeping the tribe intact. In chapter 14, all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried. And the people wept that night. What are they crying about? At verse 26 of 13, and they went and came to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation, children of Israel, unto the wilderness of Paran to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them all the congregation, showed them the fruit of the land. Nevertheless, the people be strong, dwell in the land, and so forth. An evil report. And yet, they're crying out in the night. All children of Israel, murmuring. All the children of Israel, those 10 tribes, are discouraged. Now, brethren, it doesn't take much discouragement to go a long way, does it? We can let one or two disgruntled members, it seems like they can poison the whole pot of stew and discourage a multitude of folk and cause gossip in the community against the church by taking their poison next door to their neighbors who are not Christians and discourage them. Murmur against Moses and Aaron. They murmur and they murmur and murmur. Chapter 15, the laws that they're to enact in Canaan. Chapter 16, the rebellion of Korah. Korah is attached to Balaam over here in the book of Jude. So we know right at the outset this had to do with material gain. And when I look at this, I cannot help but think of youth ministers. Korah wanted attention as well as others. Korah's grandfather was Levi. He's a cousin of Moses. And the youth ministers come and say, the elders say, we want part of this responsibility. They do, you really do? Oh, yeah. Well, how about sitting in the elders meeting when the elders call you over the irons and tell you, we don't want any more sermons on immodesty and social drinking. We don't have those problems. We need to pay the building off. Where's the youth minister? Where's the youth minister at when he's holding the hands of parents whose children have sometimes gone astray? Or he's out at the skating rink with them, doing around. Now, I know. I've been there. Been there and done that. Or had that done. Here they are. We want some of this responsibility, all right? They had 250 of renowned people, the Bible tells us. Renowned individuals. Not scumbags, renowned individuals. To come out against Moses and Aaron. Take your censors. Now here's something from cry about. When it's all said and done, we have the first earthquake that we know of at least, and it opens up and swallows them. And got the number of those that died. Now the people got something to cry about. And they said, in their tears, well, you can't go into that land. They said, we're going to go. Moses said, if you start making that trip, God is not with you. He's in the tabernacle. He's up there in a pillar of fire. They said, we're going to go it alone. And you know the record. Moses said, God won't with you. He's not with you. And the awful things that take place. Chapter 17, and the rod that budded, we saw much of that. And everyone take a rod, I don't know, maybe it was a limb off a tree, write the name on it, put it in the tabernacle, and there was one rod. It budded and bloomed, and started producing almonds. And where's that rod to be? In the most holy place. Aaron's rod that budded. What lessons? Levitical charges, chapter 18. Law of unclean and clean in 19. Miriam died in Kadesh, chapter 20 and verse 1. And on and on. Half a minute. Well, I didn't get to my notes yet. I had a few. When the children of Israel started their journey, and they're counted, there's 603,550. At this juncture, when the death, for the most part, is over, there's going to be deaths. They have 601,730. This is the second generation. This is number 26. This is the second generation now. And Moses now is preaching to them. And here is the rest of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy, about 5 speeches in Deuteronomy about what to do when you get in the land of Canaan. In my studies, I've separated the book into 5 different lessons. There may be only 3, but 5 different lessons. And the key is, don't forget to remember when you're there. Don't forget to remember.